recognising different venues will have different capacities and that a risk assessment is conducted for them. There is an issue at the moment, obviously, in terms of how loud music can be within a venue, and obviously they would need to adhere to that. But I am hopeful, as part of the task force work, this issue around live music and how loud that can be played will start to be taken forward with more in the coming weeks.
Mark Durgan.
I thank the Minister for her answer and look forward to announcements, hopefully in the very near future, on the resumption of music that will allow performers and ancillary industries to earn a living and also enhance our and everyone's enjoyment of life. Could I ask the Minister to clarify whether entertainment, and I'm thinking specifically of stand-up comedy, will fall into the same category as live music, or if they can resume on June the 21st in line with theatres reopening? And that really is on behalf of a friend.
Are you a stand-up comedian, are you? You don't. Well, that obviously the 21st is an indicative date. We're doing work at the moment with the task force and obviously working with the health department in terms of bringing forward more specifics in the time ahead to start to get venues opened. I think mitigations can be put in place if you're doing a stand-up comedy. I think the issue with music generally from a public health perspective was the louder the music is, the more people have to shout. And then it's the transmission of spit and other things in terms of the virus itself. That said, we are actively looking at mitigations that can be put in. Venues now going forward, if the indicative date is given, can do that with an increased capacity depending on the size of the venue, to have events such as stand-up comedy and others, making sure though that a risk assessment is being carried out. So more information will be given after this week's executive and also the following week as well, once those assessments are finished with the health department.
Bereavement story.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
So just the Ballycastle town strategy was published in 2009, and earlier this year my department provided funding to enable it to be reviewed. The review is ongoing and has involved consultation with local elected reps, businesses, community interest and relevant statutory bodies. The revised town strategy, or master plan as it will intend to be called moving forward, will focus on the regeneration projects that will allow Ballycastle Town Centre to grow and prosper and also to diversify in the years ahead. The review will be completed this month in June, and my department will work closely with Causeway Coast and Glensborough Council and other statutory bodies to agree how best we implement the recommendations of the master plan going forward.
Bereavement story supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer. The Minister will be aware that this has been on the cards now since 2009, and there has been limited progress made. When I was Minister, we had the successful revitalisation scheme, which brought some 200,000 into the local area in relation to the shops. But will the Minister give a commitment that the concerns of the local residents, particularly in relation to the issue of the seafront and the ferry terminal, which supplies and is very important for Rathlin Island, will be taken into consideration? Will she also give a commitment for a financial package in relation to this? And also, will she agree to meet with me and local businesses to discuss the development plan as it unfolds?
Yeah, well, obviously we're waiting on the review of the master plan being presented to us within the department. As I say, there has been ongoing engagement with the council, who have in turn been engaging with the local community as well. So I am hopeful that that review will pick up the concerns, the aspirations, the hopes of the local community there. In terms of the specifics, I mean, I don't have the plan yet, so once I do, Mervyn, in terms of the seafront and the ferry terminal, they're more than happy to meet with you, and if that's on site in Ballycastle to get me up the coast, more than happy to do that.
Jim Allister.
Probably the most notable thing about this strategy is that it's been on the books for so long, since 2009, with very little progress. But going forward, has the Minister any consciousness or any plans in relation not just to Ballycastle town, but to the many rural villages in that part of North Antrim which have suffered immense neglect in terms of community development?
In terms of regeneration and budgets that go along with regeneration, traditionally within the department, that has been focused on urban areas and particularly in larger populations. In recognising, because there's been a number of members in this chamber that have raised this point in terms of smaller rural settlements, and obviously a lot of those in previous years or mandates have been focused towards DAERA. We have done some good work with DAERA in responding to COVID, in releasing monies jointly in terms of meeting the community need, particularly in rural communities. So again, I have engaged them in looking at regeneration monies and to see if I can expand that out now to start to look at rural settlements and areas as well. Early conversations have started with DAERA. The DAERA ministers responded positively, and our officials are engaging to see what is the best way forward to address those specific concerns. So if there are issues, or again, if you want to speak to me, more than happy to do that, and I'll update members once those conversations with DAERA and a way forward conclude, and I hope that that will be soon.
Call Les Kimmins.
Garmoga can call and thank the Minister for her answers so far. Minister, could you give me an update on the Newry City Centre Master Plan, please?
I don't have an update on the master plan here now. I know there's been engagements with the local council around that, so sorry, I can write to you just to give you a more specific update on actions that have been taking place.
Call Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and thank you very much, Minister. Minister, I'm glad to hear the update on Ballycastle Town strategy, but could you confirm when the High Street strategy will confirm actions to assist all towns to recover from the impacts of COVID?
There's ongoing engagements with local councils and in the department at the moment. Obviously, there was monies also that went out as part of COVID in terms of the revitalisation fund that went into local councils and that would hit town centres as well in terms of looking at revitalisation. So once those conversations conclude, we'll be outlining the direction of travel very shortly. So once I have more detail on that, Kelly, I can write to you formally as well and then update the committee and the chamber.
Remember Pat Sheehan. I call Pat Sheehan.
Mr Cook, question 5, please.
Thank you. The Sports Sustainability Fund has provided funding totalling £23 million to 35 sports governing bodies to cover their losses and those of their affiliated clubs. I can advise that awards have been made through the sport governing bodies to 452 individual beneficiaries of the fund. The funding has proven to be essential to help sustain our sports sector and the services they provide to local communities. The sports governing bodies and their clubs have been able to provide a safe return to activities as the restrictions have been lifted. Sport NI are now involved in a post-award vouching and verification process to ensure the funds have been used for the purposes provided. Should any irregularities in the fund, Sport NI has the option to request partial or full recovery of those funds.
Supplementary, Pat Sheehan.
Thank the Minister for that, and I welcome the fact that the greatest part of this support has gone to grassroots sporting organisations, and it's particularly encouraging that women's sport has featured so prominently. And would the Minister agree with me that grassroots sporting organisations have played a vital role during the pandemic? They're often the linchpin in the communities that they're from, and it's important that they continue to be supported in the future.
Yeah, thanks very much. Almost 80% of this funding has went to grassroots sports organisations across the north. As I say, through all of those governing bodies. Sports has played a huge role. I mean, I know at the start of the pandemic, working with the Executive Office, primarily the IFA, Ulster Rugby and the GAA came together to look at how they could provide a strategic response in assisting, whether that was vaccination rollout, food response, looking at medical supplies, and we worked really well with those. I also know in meeting over the last year, and particularly the last few months, grassroots sports clubs right across the north in urban and rural settings, the contribution that they made in the pandemic within their local community, offering their sports facilities and clubs in order to help that community response and delivering food parcels and other issues as well. And it's something that I want to continue to engage with them. I mean, I know one of the biggest areas is around the need for small capital resources to assist clubs further where they can upgrade the facilities that they have, and I'm hopeful to look at a scheme coming forward in the short term to support them further in the time ahead.
Justin McNulty, very briefly, please.
Minister, fortitude and prudence, that's the motto of College Land O'Reilly's Cumann Lucas Gale, who you visited with me a number of weeks back, who were very grateful for the support you received. Minister, can you give me your assessment of whether the Sports Sustainability Fund has achieved its purpose and addressing the issues as a result of the consequences of the pandemic, and how do you advise small clubs who have lost their funding streams through the pandemic to what funding streams are available for them to access to improve their facilities for a small rural club in Armagh?
Yeah, no, well, I was delighted to be in Armagh and to visit the club, and you could just see with the young people there on the pitch, both playing camogie, hurling and football, just the impact that it had. And I know in talking to the families and some of the coaches, just having young people back playing sports again, it's been a really good thing. And obviously the contribution that clubs like that have had over this last year, and really when they haven't been there playing, the absence of that, just the loss that the community has felt, and a real value for the contribution that they make to society, and particularly in rural communities as well. So, I mean, I do want to support them. I do think that the Sports Sustainability Fund did play a critical role. I think when the committee looked at this, they recognised that as well. I think the fact that almost 80% of the funds went into grassroots sports kind of demonstrates the demand that was there and also the need that was there as well. I mean, I recognise that some fell through that, they didn't get the apply in time. There are now issues, moving forward in terms of the opening up and those that still find themselves in hardship. We did get more money under the COVID monies recently around sport, an additional $5 million, and obviously I want to work with grassroots clubs and also the governing bodies and how we can look at that going forward to reassess the need, and obviously working with Sport NI. There are also opportunities, I would say to any club listening, to make sure you're registered with Sport NI for opportunities around funding and support that is available. There is a small pot of money that can be applied to via Sport NI to look at sustainability of clubs post-COVID. And again, I would just advise people to go to the Sport NI website to get assistance around that.
That ends the period for list of questions. We now move on to 15 minutes of a topical question, and I call Trevor Lunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister mentioned intimidation points a while ago in answer to Mr. Clark's question. Can I ask her, is Base 2 still being used to assess applications in respect of intimidation points?
Yes, there's still an engagement there, and obviously working with the PSNI as well around verification. I think there is a recognition in terms of looking at the housing selection scheme and looking at the issue of intimidation points more. We need to look at that verification process and making sure that that's as stringent as it can possibly be for those who have been intimidated, and also weeding out others who haven't, who are maybe trying to use the system. So those assessments are ongoing at the moment, and obviously looking at the issue when the consultation on the housing selection scheme was brought out, the issue of women, gender violence, domestic violence was brought up very strongly as well. And I suppose a concern that if you remove them now without doing more work, you could leave people disadvantaged. So yes, work is continuing, and obviously we're doing a review of intimidation points more broadly, and I'll be bringing that back to the committee as soon as we've concluded that.
Supplementary, Trevor Lunn.
Yes, I thank the Minister for her answer. Mrs McCullion, in the Minister's absence a few months ago, indicated that it's possible a new body would be set up to replace Base 2. So if that happened, can we be assured that any new assessment body will not have in its membership persons with a known association to criminal or paramilitary groups, given that such organisations are themselves involved in intimidation and expulsion activity?
Yeah, I think Annie, if we're going to go ahead with a new body, all of that's being assessed at the moment, so I can't give too much now until all of that's done. But I think there is a recognition to make sure that the evidence presented is robust, that it's clear. There is a recognition, that not everybody still goes to the PSNI, albeit that's the main body in terms of getting evidence around intimidation, and also looking at community information that's coming forward as well to support a claim or not. So obviously we're looking at all of that at the moment. We're obviously looking at any implications or unintended consequences for next steps. And once I have clarity on a way forward, I'll come back and present, but I'll also follow it up in a response to yourself specifically.
Jerry Kelly, call Jerry Kelly.
Good morning, Cian Corley. And could the Minister give some detail on the expected benefits and the planned reform of the gambling legislation which she's just brought forward?
Yeah, well, obviously I got agreement, thankfully, from my executive colleagues in terms of bringing forward this bill. I know there was a brief presentation to the committee last week, and obviously it will be presented in the coming period. The gambling changes, I mean, there hasn't been a change in the legislation from when I was 5 years old, 35 years ago, or 36 years ago. So it's long overdue. When the legislation was there, the internet wasn't a thing, it wasn't created. And again, it shows there's a need for a review. I have agreed to take the gambling legislation. Obviously, there's been consultation. There's a lot of interest within the Chamber on the important issues of reforming the existing laws. But we're going to do it in a two-phased approach. So the first phase going forward now, that I am hopeful will be done by the end of this mandate, is to look at introducing a code of practice on those who are operating, is to look at a levy, is to bring in new criminal proceedings around those who allow young people, particularly around gaming machines. So there are a number of changes and also easements around proposals for Good Friday and Sunday openings, and again as well to allow charities to raise money. This was an issue was raised by NICFA, to allow them to sell ballots online and as a way of fundraising, and particularly during the COVID pandemic when you weren't allowed to meet in person, that became a vital issue around their resources and funds. The second part of the legislation will be more work needs to be done, and we're starting that around online gambling, which is probably a bigger issue. Because it is unregulated. There are issues around advertising laws, which are reserved matters. So in recognising we're not going to get all of that through in this mandate, I am starting assessment works, consultation works to be carried out, so that we can start prepping legislation for the new mandate after the election next year.
Supplementary, Jerry Kelly.
Going weakest lesson area Lahan Fragger Guji Shaw, and it was a very I thank the Minister for her answer, and it was very comprehensive. She may have taken some of my questions off me. But in terms of, I want to thank her for the determination to deal with the issue. But given that the legislation has not kept up with technological changes, and she touched on this in her answer, could she also provide some detail on the main issues emerging from the consultation around that? Please.
Yeah, I think it's a huge area, and it's probably the biggest area in fairness, because this legislation that we currently have, there was no internet at that time, so it is completely unregulated in that sense, although there are other powers that can be used in the interim. So there has to be consultation and engagement to look at the nature of online gambling, how widespread it is, the impacts that it has here. There's obviously issues then around reserved matters at Westminster, around advertising, for example, as well, that we need to pick up on. So work is going to begin around those areas, and that's why we're breaking the legislation down. I wanted to make sure that we brought in some protections in this mandate, and that's the bill that I've presented to the Executive last week. Work is ongoing now then to look particularly at the bigger area of online gambling for legislation to be ready for the next mandate.
Robin Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, via the Communities Committee, of which I'm a member, and via written questions, I have attempted to find out if the Job Start scheme allows the participants to get a vocational qualification. I've been amazed at the different answers when a simple yes or no would have been sufficient. Would the Minister confirm if participants in a Job Start scheme can work towards a vocational qualification?
It will depend on the employer and the other support that they can get within the Social Security Department. So obviously the opportunities are 6-month placements. They don't go beyond that unless you're registered as disabled. You can go for a 9-month placement. So to get a vocational training in that time scale may be restrictive depending on what it is you want to do. But there is flexibility working with work coaches that any young person or individual or indeed company that want to offer training opportunities, that we can look to support that through schemes going forward. So there's nothing set down specifically to say you're going to get a vocational qualification, albeit we would want to encourage that, because the whole point of Job Start is to make sure that people are work ready, is that they're being skilled up. We could offer other opportunities, around, we do the CV support, we do application support, we can look at training opportunities. We've obviously made changes, I know it won't be relating to this, but around universal credit and childcare in terms of trying to free up opportunities there for people who have children to look at getting into employment. So yes, they can be looked at on individual, but I'll go back, if you haven't had a specific answer to the question, Robin, I'll go back and see why and then respond to you directly.
Supplementary, Robin Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It just seems simply the answer is no. You cannot get, as Job Start is operating today, you cannot get a vocational qualification. So you enrol in the programme and you leave without a qualification to say how you have benchmarked yourself against an NVQ 1, 2 or 3, whatever it might be. But can I ask the Minister, how many employers have enrolled now to deliver the Job Start scheme?
There's over 405 employers who have enrolled to deliver it in a variety of areas, and I have visited some of those employers recently. Obviously we are looking, the Job Start scheme is one element of support that we can offer within the department. We're obviously also working with the Department of Economy as well. So it is a limited scheme in some ways. It's a 6-month placement. It's to give people the opportunity to be in a workplace where that's funded, to get to work with an employer and with other employees, and really to build the area to see if they're interested in that as a career path. We can then support them through the wider Social Security Agency supports, that if they do want to progress along that career or looking at another career opportunity as well. And we're obviously working with the Economy Minister in terms of apprenticeship opportunities as a way of progression beyond the Job Start scheme.
Call Chris Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is a big supporter of sport and spoke warmly of enlisted questions of her visits to Gaelic clubs across Northern Ireland. Can I ask why she's declined my invitation to meet with Glentoran Football Club to learn more about the valuable work they are doing, the needs they have, and indeed the exciting plans they have for future development to promote sporting and community development in an area designated for community regeneration in Inner East Belfast?
Well, I haven't just met Gaelic clubs. I've met football teams, I've met rugby teams, I've met hockey. I've met a variety of sports over the last while, and obviously even in the midst of lockdown. I've met many sports organisations in terms of responding to COVID. I have said previously that I am willing to meet with clubs. Obviously in the context of sub-regional stadia, I need to watch engaging clubs when I'm going to be making a decision on a future programme as well. But I'm more than happy to meet with yourself and with the club Glentoran as well. I've no issue at all.
Supplementary, Chris Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome that answer, and we can, of course, in any visitor meeting, highlight the excellent work that goes on to support boys, girls, inclusive disability football programmes and plans for contributing to community regeneration. I think the Minister would be really excited by the plans in place at Glentoran Football Club, and I'd be delighted if she joined me to meet with the club.
There's no problem. No matter where I go, somebody's a member of Glentoran in one way or another, even though I'm not, admittedly. But more than happy to take up the invite.
Next member is not in his place, and I now call Linda Dillon.
Minister, I want to commend you for fulfilling the commitment set out in NDNA to provide a translation hub. Can you provide an assessment of the expected use of the hub and what services are available?
Yeah, so just obviously there's been the establishment of the Central Translation Hub. It was one of the commitments in New Decade, New Approach. Phase 1 of the establishment of the hub for Irish and Ulster Scots went live in April of this year. Phase 2, the establishment of a framework contract managed by the Hub for newcomer languages will go live in October of this year as well. And initially the Hub is using a hybrid model for operations, which includes an in-house team of Irish translation and enhanced outsource collaborative framework, providing written translation for all. Also, the sourcing of Ulster Scots translations is presenting some unique challenges, including the lack of an agreed standard in terms of spelling, grammar and terminology. But we're continuing to work with the Ulster Scots Agency and others in terms of the development of that aspect of the translation hub as well. In the first 5 weeks in the operation of the hub, there's been 36 requests for Irish translations, totalling 172,000 words, and 4 requests for Ulster Scots translations, totalling 7,000 words.
Linda Dillon, supplementary.
And can I thank the Minister for her answer? And I suppose I should declare an interest at this point as a mother of a child who's being taught through the medium of Irish and somebody that has a great keen interest in it. Can you give us an update on the Irish language strategy, please?
Yeah, well, just at the moment, obviously, I have responsibility to bring forward a number of strategies, including the Irish language and Ulster Scots strategy, and obviously I'm committed to bringing those forward. I wanted to adopt the same approach as our other inclusion strategies around gender, LGBTQI, disability and anti-poverty, where we want to set up an expert panel that brings forward research and where the situation is at the moment in terms of the languages and heritage aspects, and then to look at a co-design approach working with the Ulster Scots community and Irish language community as well, and bringing forward that. I've obviously put my proposals forward to the Executive, and I'm just waiting on that being approved to go ahead and to set up the expert panel and the co-design groups.
Call Andy Allen, and you won't have time for a supplementary.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for meeting with me recently to discuss the Masonettes on Knocknagonie Avenue? And I wonder if the Minister might be able to provide an update on her department's consideration of the Northern Ireland Town Executive's proposal.
It's still being looked at, Andy, at the moment, so I will be doing a meeting again soon with officials. But I have your meeting, I have it on my to-do list in terms of issues that we're going to be picking up. So they're doing some final assessments in terms of some of the additional information that you provided at the meeting. And as soon as I have a way forward, I'll come back to you directly just to update you.
Members, and time is up, and members, please take your ease for a moment or two to switch the table. Thank you.
Okay, members, we now return to the motion from the Committee for Infrastructure on unadopted roads, and I call the Chairperson of the Committee for Infrastructure to open debate on the motion, please.
Speaker, and I have to say from the outset that it is of concern that almost 9 years after the Regional Development Committee presented its findings on unadopted roads to this Assembly, that the Committee for Infrastructure feels the need to bring this motion to the Chamber today. All of us, I'm sure, can give examples of constituents affected by this. While the extent of the issue is by no means as widespread as when questions were first being raised, it remains a problem for a large number of householders across Northern Ireland. That this is the case almost 9 years after the recommendations of the Regional Development Committee's findings were accepted is, however, alarming. On the 7th of February 2012, during a debate in this chamber, the then Minister for Regional Development said, "I recognise the concerns of local homeowners who find themselves in new housing developments where developers have left roads and sewage systems unfinished. Road Service and Northern Ireland Water are making use of the current legislation and procedures to address these problems, but this process takes time to complete. Surely after almost a decade, we should be far closer to resolving this than the committee has found we actually are." 9 months after the Minister's statement was made in this chamber, the then Committee for Regional Development published a report of its findings following an inquiry into this matter. The report highlighted that at that time there were anything between 1,200 and 3,500 unadopted roads and some 1,200 sewage schemes in backlog, and that critically Northern Ireland Water and the Department for Regional Development were unable to quantify the precise numbers. At its meeting on the 12th of May 2021, nearly a decade on, the Committee for Infrastructure found that this was still the case and that the recommendations made in the 2012 report to address the backlog are yet to be fully considered. This begs the question, how can the issue ever be rectified if even the full extent of the problem is not known? Owning a property on an unadopted road is not always a problem. However, in situations where there are inadequate management arrangements for these roads, it can become a serious problem for the property owners. Selling such properties can be difficult, as prospective purchasers can't obtain a mortgage or buy the property, and lenders are reluctant to lend money for the purchase of properties such as these. The result is often owners being unable to sell their property, potentially having to reduce the sale price or being limited to selling to cash buyers. The Department manages the adoption of new roads that are determined as part of the planning process. The term determined means that a road is suitable for adoption into the maintained road network once it is completed in accordance with the approved drawings. In theory, once planning permission is received, the Department works with the developer, the lender and the bond company to progress the adoption of a development's roads in a timely fashion under the Private Streets Northern Ireland Order in 1980. As part of the planning application consideration, it must be clear the standards of completion that will be achieved are appropriate. If that is the case, the private street is determined and considered determined. The developer then takes out a bond and the road is constructed and adopted. It is illegal for a developer to commence works on new developments without having an Article 32 agreement and bond in place. These allow the Department to bring any development up to adoption standard should the developer fail to do so for any reason. However, sites still remain where no bond exists. One of the recommendations made in the 2012 report related to the role of solicitors. The committee heard the Department did engage with the Law Society in 2012 and that following this there has been a greater awareness amongst solicitors of the importance of a bond being in place for purchasing a property. However, there is also the issue of adequacy of the bond that needs to be taken into account. 2 recommendations in the 2012 report dealt with this, one suggesting the inclusion of an inflationary amount and the other around calling in the bond amount earlier in the process to reduce the risk to health and safety issues for residents. Neither of these have been adequately addressed. The committee heard that some sites remain unadopted due to sewage and road issues that the Department has no powers to remediate. There is a concern in these instances is that without the inflationary amount, the bond's value lessens the longer it is in place, and I, along with others, am aware of cases where the bond can no longer cover the cost of the works required, and the developer company has been wound up or cannot meet the obligations. I'm also aware that many sites have issues, not just with roads, but with Northern Ireland Water infrastructure. The committee recognises that and found some comfort that Northern Ireland Water at least is proactively trying to identify high priority and legacy sites to establish what the problems are at each. The Department is working with them to get this moved on and completed. This long overdue prioritisation audit was also a recommendation of the 2012 report. But the question needs to be asked, are there further cross-departmental working practices that could be set up to make more of an impact, and what is being done to seek further powers to be able to do something about it. The committee were advised that it has been some time since the last review of bond adequacy. Officials advised that they were working to update previous submissions in relation to bond rates and will shortly bring something to the Minister. However, the committee believe this needs to be reviewed as a matter of urgency in order to avoid the need for enforcement and systemic failures, which adversely affect the lives of those in affected developments. Which brings me to enforcement action by the Department in cases where the system does not work. It's alarming to hear that the Department has only approximately 20 staff who cover 3,470 live bonds plus all the enforcement cases. Prior to 2015, the Department had double that number. The Department has reduced capacity to take enforcement action where a developer had commenced without a bond in place or at the other end of the process when they failed to complete the development. The result is an enforced reactive rather than proactive approach to enforcement, which is simply unacceptable. To get back to a proactive mode and to be better placed to know the number of sites and levels of occupancy, we need to go back to these pre-reduction levels. This is a stark example of just how reduced resource budget constraints impact on capacity and how this translates into failings in delivery to the public. The committee acknowledges that much work has and is being done successfully despite these constraints. However, it is the backlog and legacy sites that are of particular concern. Adoption of sites is triggered by occupancy rates, with 80% occupancy being a key trigger. Yet a number of sites have reached this threshold and still remain unadopted, many since around the time of the property crash in 2007. Indeed, there is a road which was bonded in 1988, which remains unadopted. There are some cases where enforcement cannot be used to guide the works, typically where there are land issues or access issues. The way forward in these instances is to try to work with the developers and residents to resolve the outstanding issues, which is less than ideal. Finally, as well as unadopted roads that are part of the Private Streets Northern Ireland Order process, members will be aware that there are a number that sit outside that. There is a provision in the order to adopt such sites, but as with any development, it's a prerequisite that the site needs to be brought up to an adoptable standard before the Department will take it on. To give a sense of the scale, a study that was done about 10 years ago identified that there are over 620 kilometres of unadopted roads and laneways that sit outside the private streets process. The cost of bringing those up to a standard sufficient to allow for their adoption would be in the order of £300 million. In addition, somewhere in the range of £41 million and £100 million was identified as being needed to allow for adoption of sewage and wastewater schemes. It was noted that even then that it was extremely unlikely those levels of investment could be acquired from central government. Those fears have proved prophetic, with ongoing budget constraints providing the same concerns today. However, the Committee for Infrastructure, just like Regional Development Committee before it, believes that despite this, actions can and must be identified and taken to rectify this problem, and that a coordinated effort by all sectors involved in the process could see major improvements in even the most critical cases. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Initiatum Sir Cahill Boylan on Couch. I call Cahill Boylan.
Gormagat, Nash Can Corley August Boylan Lorch Evaver, our son and Ruan Shaw, and I raise to speak in favour of the motion and also welcome the opportunity. It's an important subject for the committee. And it's an equality issue too, Minister, because some of these developments are not finished. You have the likes of risen manhole covers and all of that there. Services don't go in, so I raise the issue of equality in terms of provision of service, because the likes of bin lorries and all don't go into some of these developments. And I'd like to just put that on record. And I hope that the motion today will speed things up and we will address it. And the Chair has outlined many of the things that I'm sure, Mr Deputy Speaker, that many others will mention. But I just want to go back because I think there was a good piece of work, and if I take the timeline back from 2012, there was a good piece of work done by that previous committee. And reading up on some of the report and some of the terms of reference on what they did at that time, they have come out with very good recommendations. And what I would put to the Minister is, could she outline today in the chamber, or even in writing if she can't, those recommendations that have been adopted over those number of years and what she's using? Because I think it's vitally important that those are outlined here today. I want to go to some of the, because the Chair's already mentioned some of the points. In terms of the private street order, now, I know at the time the previous Minister had said that it was suitable to work at that time, and I don't think the Minister at the time was keen to go down the route of looking at that piece of legislation. I'm just wondering, in light of what has happened and what has taken place, has the Minister or would she indicate whether she will take a look at that piece of legislation to see can we tighten things up in terms of moving some of those developments on, or reviews in relation to that? The other point I want to mention, the Chair did mention in her own contribution. I wrote to the Minister in relation to the voluntary exit scheme, and the Minister, you wrote back to me and you said that there was 43.5 full-time equivalents, and now it's down to 22. So, I mean, clearly looking at it from the outside, that's nearly a reduction of 50%. So maybe the Minister would comment on that, and the impact that actually would have in relation to delivering the services. And it's not, I don't think the committee, when we were talking, when we have approached this subject, Mr Deputy Speaker, it wasn't a case of we're against the developers, but we've got to remember that there's individuals out here, hard-working individuals, who are buying houses, who are paying their fees, going and getting solicitor advice, paying their fees and everything else, and they're not getting treated properly either. And it's something we need to be at the forefront. The other point I want to mention is, and it's going to be vitally important as we move forward into an economic recovery, there's a lot of these developments now going to be needing to bring forward and play their part in the economic recovery, and we need to tighten up the system, and we need to look at what's I would advise the Minister to go back to look at some of the recommendations in the 2012 report. The other point I'd like to raise is there is a review into the bonds issue at the minute. Just maybe the Minister would touch on what the terms of reference to that is, and how we could, even working together as a committee, how we can work together to try and address that issue. And my final point, obviously, I'd like to make, we're now going through a planning review, Minister, and in some cases here, and I know everybody goes around saying, you know, it's developer-led and it's the responsibility of the developer, absolutely. But in cases that doesn't happen, I've been talking to councillors recently, and everybody thinks, now, we have made some progress, we definitely have, but people think that there's the bond, there's no problem, it's working, the system's working okay. It's not. There's very few bonds actually enacted. I think I've worked one where there's one bond enacted in all the number of years that I have been a councillor representative. So I would stress to the Minister that there's an opportunity in the planning review, through the condition of a planning application, that we might use that opportunity, Minister, to introduce it under a planning application. So, I support the motion.
Good. I guess next item, Sir Dolores Kelly on Cancha. I call Dolores Kelly.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The committee, as the chairperson said, heard a presentation from officials from Road Service, because it is something that not only this committee, but as others have indicated, other committees over the years have felt that needed further inspection. It is an issue which comes across all of our constituency desks, and I think that people have been very patient, because we had, of course, the collapse, the financial collapse in 07-08. Then we had a lot of companies, particularly construction companies, going bust, and the whole situation around NAMA, and nobody knew who owned what for a number of years. And of course, this place itself was suspended for 3 years, which obviously didn't help in pursuing some errant developers. But it is very confusing for many householders having to chase down different agencies, not only officials, within the Regional Development or Infrastructure Department, but also within councils around who has power for what, because at times people are going to environmental health and then they're being told, oh, it's not us, it's them. So it is a bit confusing for householders. And one of the things I find, Minister, in terms of making representation on behalf of my constituents, is many of them don't want to go public on it because they're then worried about the impact that might have if they wish to sell their own property. And so they feel that their hands are a wee bit tied. And I think there is an issue of responsibility that has to be addressed by solicitors in terms of conveyancing and doing the relevant checks. I will give way.
I fully agree with the member on that. And in particular, has the member been encouraging her constituents to complain to their solicitor, and if not getting a response, to complain to the Law Society, because the legal system who charge people for conveyancing should have done due diligence and, in my opinion, have liabilities.
Members, next a minute.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the member for his intervention, because indeed we have been doing just that with a development, particularly in my constituency, which the Minister will be aware of, but I don't want to name publicly because I want to respect the views of the constituents who don't want to go public on it, was particularly in relation to NIW and the lack of some terms of the stick in terms of what can be done. And during the boom years, as Mr Beggs highlighted, I think solicitors were very quick at getting sales out the door, and I do question some of the due diligence that some of them may well have responsibilities, and I have advised constituents to go down that particular route. So it is something, as members know, has, as Mr Boylan said, consequences for the delivery of other services in terms of bin collection, etc. That's something also I've dealt with over the years, never mind damage to cars with, as he said, the drainage lids sticking up well above the ground. And I do think the time has come for developers to take a greater level of responsibility. I do know that the 80% sales and occupancy is one that seems to be quite high, because I've spoken to some developers, and I know from speaking to some of them, they know that a lot of the additional finance burden for them in terms of paying the taxes for the sales of the houses, as well as some of the bonds, falls to them once they go over that threshold. And perhaps, Minister, it might be something you want to look at in any subsequent review. But your officials did make it very clear to the committee that resources are and continue to be a huge issue, both in terms of the number of street inspectors over the years, which I believe have halved at least, and under the voluntary exit scheme, and then of course in terms of financial resourcing to the department. I think I looked at one stage in terms of maintenance, that the budget for infrastructure fell from over £50 million per annum to more recently £27 million in terms of maintenance. And you know, those things come at a cost, and the cost is terms of the service delivery. I know we all want to work smarter, not harder, but some jobs do require a labour-intensive resource to have to actually do the delivery. One of the things I had wondered when thinking about this is, in terms of agriculture, we have a number of different farm inspectors. You have building control inspectors, for example, go on sites. You have obviously the department's infrastructure inspectors. I just wonder, can there not be an agreement across departments where one inspector could report back on a number of findings to NIW, to road service, and indeed to building control, and therefore share the load a wee bit? It's something I had wondered about as a resolution, because as we know, the budget isn't getting any better, Minister. I think it remains challenging for the foreseeable future, certainly for your tenure and going forward. I know you've worked very hard at trying to consider all of these issues and see the best way forward. But, Mr Speaker, it's the biggest investment anyone will make, and the majority of us will make in our lifetime, and that's to buy a house and our home. And I think it's only but right that when we bought the dream, if you like, that it is as it appeared on the brochure, or now more increasingly on Instagram, or on the wee videos that you can watch in terms of what you're buying in the turnkey houses. So I would hope, Minister, that...
I would ask the member to draw remarks to a close.
Well, this does have all party support, and I think it's to be supportive of the Minister and moving forward. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
I call Roy Beggs.
Deputy Speaker, I would firstly declaring interest in that I live on a shared laneway, an unadopted shared laneway. But I wish to make it clear that I have no expectation that the department is going to come in and re-tarmac the roadway to improve access to my property. That would be unrealistic. Similarly, we have to recognise that is the same in terms of financial pressures on the department for all the hundreds of kilometres of private laneways that exist in Northern Ireland. The department is struggling to maintain the road service of our existing road network. That is the reality of the current funding arrangement. And it's important that we do not create unrealistic expectations. In preparing this debate, I did review the then Regional Development Committee's inquiry recommendations in 2012, and it's clear in reading them that many of the feelings were in relation to a lack of understanding of both purchasers and, I dare say, solicitors in terms of the aspects of having adequate road and sewage bonds to protect the purchaser should something go wrong. And I'm pleased that recently in front of the committee, the departmental official advises that in trying to attract people to buy a property, this is as of today, it is in the developer's interest to take out a bond because their solicitors will pick that up at an early stage if it's not bonded, and that has encouraged developers to take out bonds. But again, as I indicated earlier during my intervention, I certainly view if a solicitor failed to pick that out in some historical purchase, that there has been a failure in that solicitor to carry out due diligence. On a number of occasions, I have advised my constituents to write to their solicitor seeking appropriate compensation, and if unsuccessful, to complain to the Law Society. Certainly.
In the intervention, would the member agree with me that not all of the issues can be resolved by bonds? I have a number of areas in my own constituency where it is sightlines that is the issue and bond cannot be used to resolve that, and we really need to look at that issue also around planning and ensuring that sightlines are in place before houses can be completed and sold.
Members, next a minute.
I have come across that issue myself in my constituency, a group of housings in Prospects in Carrick. Fergus suffered from that, and in fact the roads weren't adopted until 18 years after they were originally built. A remarkable period of time. Thankfully on that occasion some clever thinking went in, and ramps were put in to reduce the speed on that road, which then reduced the sight lines, and that enabled the roads to be adopted. Yes, problems can happen, and the earlier that homeowners move on such issues, the better, before walls, etc., might be built and cause problems. As has been indicated, there are particular pressures on the department in following up some of the historical failings in the past, but it does seem to say that things have got better. But we've been told that there's approximately 20 staff for some 3,470 live road bonds applications, but the numbers inspecting and following up has been halved in line with the change in the budget allocated to the department. So there's a real issue that if we want to chase some of the historical failings, the investment has to go in to trying to resolve the issue, to draw down the bonds, because it does take time, and to identify where the failings occurred. As I say, I would commend officials both in who work with me in parts of Carrick Fergus, and again Lindara and Larne, where another occasion where the developer went bust. But because there were roads bonds in place and water bonds, work was corrected and the roads were finished. However, I am aware of a very significant failing in the planning system, and I speak of Larne Road West, a major spine road where hundreds and hundreds of new houses have been built, but somehow a very small portion, perhaps 100 metres, have been orphaned off. And despite millions of pounds being building a new spine road, there's a missing link. Somehow, instead of that owner of that piece of land having a liability, because it was not linked to any of his other land that he once owned, it has become a ransom strip. And we've got a Mexican standoff and everyone in that area are suffering because of failures in the planning system and the department to ensure that the development-led road was built. That is definitely a failing, and I would ask the Minister, how is this ever going to be addressed? Do we need a regeneration bill to give authority to local council to invest? They say they presently can do nothing. I've lobbied the Minister, I've lobbied the former Permanent Secretary. TransLink cannot put on a public transport route to all these houses because of the missing section of Spine Road. This is a major failing in our planning system. It's something that does need to be addressed. We need to get a solution. The public are suffering. We are actually encouraging use of private cars rather than public transport. There's additional emissions being developed. So I really would urge the Minister to outline how can we ever resolve such a situation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Andrew Muir.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I do welcome the fact that we're discussing this important matter here today in this Assembly. As has already been remarked upon, the figures on the number of unadopted roads across Northern Ireland and the cost of bringing them up to the required standard are stark. In addressing the Infrastructure Committee last month, the Department's Director of Network Services stated that the process for the adoption of roads works well most of the time. Theoretically, the developer-led process should be quite simple. The Department determines that new roads are suitable for adoption as part of the planning process. The developer and the lender agree a bond to be held by a bond company. And if the developer is unwilling or unable to deliver the infrastructure to the agreed standard, the Department can use that bond to bring the road and other infrastructure to the point at which they can be adopted. But if the theory worked perfectly in practice, then there would be no need for today's debate, nor for the Regional Development Committee's recommendations in 2012. And this debate is therefore quite important. Without doubt, one of the biggest factors as to why the process is not working well is in relation to the reduction of capacity within the Minister's department. We all know that the Department of Infrastructure had its funding slashed a number of years ago by the austerity budgets from Westminster. And a lot of the issues we are seeing with our infrastructure today, including unadopted roads, come back to, at least in part, to that decision. At the Infrastructure Committee last month, we learned that prior to the budget cuts of a number of years ago, the Department had approximately double the number of staff working on unadopted roads compared to what we have now. On that basis, there can be no surprise that the issues identified in the 2012 report have not all been addressed. I welcome that today's motion recognises the resource constraints and the need for cross-departmental working. But the reality is that while there are very few resources and a lot of different competing priorities within the department, such as investing in our water infrastructure, upgrading our creek and roads, and tackling the climate emergency by investing in sustainable and active travel, there is a limit to the amount of resources that are able to go into this area we are debating here today. There are, however, have been important steps forward since the 2012 report, including making solicitors more aware of the process, and I would agree with the interventions by Mr Beggs in relation to that issue. This is fundamental. People pay quite significant solicitors' fees for the transaction and the completion of that and the conveyancing process, and they deserve to ensure that that work is carried out to standard. Officials have informed us that even in spite of the budget cuts, the system is working better than it was, although a range of cases still cause a range of difficulties, and we see those reported in the media very regularly. I also welcome the fact that the Department is prioritising the backload of sites and focusing the Department's work on the basis of need, such as sites which have 80% occupancy. It's not ideal, but if you have 80% or more occupancy, the road really does need adopted. We should not underestimate the mental strain for someone who purchased a property in the reasonable expectation that their road and other facilities would be adopted. These people should not be left in a state of permanent perpetuity. It's wrong. In addition to the mental strain, there are also physical safety and public health risks to residents and visitors living on roads that have not been completed. I know at least one road in my constituency, when you're out walking and you come across it, you need to be careful that you don't fall and hurt yourself, and also it's a miracle the cars aren't more severely damaged. Yes, no problem.
Again, I thank the member for taking an intervention, but we talked earlier, some of the contributors talked earlier about equality and equality issues And whilst it's difficult for those of us who are able-bodied, anyone with mobility issues, particularly those who are older or have to use wheelchairs in some of these developments, have no chance of being able to get in and out of their own home.
Members, next a minute.
Thank you, and I would agree with Mrs Dillon. It's crucial when you see some of the roads and pavements, and I'm able-bodied, so I can navigate them. If you're a wheelchair user or you're someone who needs assistance, it's impossible, and it's a miracle. And I would say if we actually did some research in terms of the amount of people who have actually caused injuries in relation to this infrastructure. So this is something that has a real impact on people's day-to-day lives, and it's something that we as an institution and the department and also developers, most crucially, the developers who build these developments and don't finish them to the correct standard, have a responsibility for. And as I was outlining, I have been contacted by residents in my own constituency who are facing precisely these issues. I am supportive of the Department's approach, which is to work closely with developers and residents in the first instance. And this is often the quickest and easiest way of resolving outstanding issues that prevent adoption, if the developer comes back and if the developer is still in existence. Far too many times, the developer just disappears, shrugs her shoulders and leaves local residents with these developments. I'm also supportive of the fact that the Department is using its legal and enforcement powers when the developers just aren't playing ball. In terms of actions the Department can take to improve the current situation, there is no doubt the 3-year absence of power sharing prevented that progress. The level of bonds do need to be increased, and I hope the Minister considers that issue in due course. In closing, Mr Deputy Speaker, in spite of the good work by officials, there is still a long way to travel in terms of tackling this important issue, which directly impacts upon people. I support the motion. Thank you.
I call Keith Buchanan.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I also rise in favour of the motion and believe that a full and systematic review of the private street adoption process should happen. While I welcome the fact that the bond conditions are being reviewed within the Department, we believe that the exercise should extend further than just a consideration of its value. While I note that progress has been made, and I am concerned that there is still work needed to complete all the outstanding unadopted roads throughout Northern Ireland, given the extensive everyday impact the failure to adopt roads has on those families and households affected, we find it entirely unacceptable that the level of enforcement actions by DFI roads has declined in recent years. We would like to see consideration of making bonds time-limited, but first and foremost they must be adequate to account for inflation and their reducing value over time, as was the recommendation of the Regional Development Committee inquiry in 2012. There is a need for an all-inclusive review of the private street adoption process. The process for calling in a bond and taking enforcement action continues to be too complex and lengthy, compounding the problems faced by the affected households who may face daily issues around health and safety. While we appreciate the budgetary constraints and difficulties the Department is operating under, a study carried out in 2012 found that there were over 620 kilometres of unadopted roads and laneways in Northern Ireland that were not private roads that fell within the normal private streets determination process, and an estimate that 300 million would be needed to clear the backlog in unadopted roads. This did not include for additional items such as land purchase or any required structures or utility works. It would be interesting to have a fresh estimate of this figure. The Department also needs to review and improve the working partnership with Northern Ireland Water and other agencies to ensure any problem is rectified, especially with issues such as sewage. The bond should be sufficient to meet all needs, and with buy-in from all agencies, this needs to ensure roads are adopted in a timely fashion. We would support a review of DFI statutory powers in this area. There is also an issue of historic unadopted roads. This is where council developments on other sites have never been completed to the required standard. Article 9 of the Private Streets Order allows DFI to consider the adoption of some roads if the majority of owners request it and the road or street is first brought up to the required adoption standard. There needs to be a simplified and streamlined process to call in a bond and take enforcement action. Continues to be complex, and this compounds the problems faced by householders. We also appreciate that the number of bonds have increased in the post-recession period, but also note that unfortunately there has been a gradual reduction in the number of enforcement actions since 2015/16. It is our understanding that this is not because the problem is diminishing, but rather that the staff is very overstretched. Previous contributors have referred to this. During a recent committee meeting on the 12th of May, 2021, the Department revealed that following restructuring of the Department and retirements, there are now only approximately 20 staff working on private streets, and this is to cover the 3,470 live bonds plus the enforcement. This is a reduction of approximately half of what the Department had prior to 2015. While we accept that sizeable investment is needed and that there is no easy solution to the problem of unadopted roads, we need the Minister to demonstrate her commitment to review current practices in a way that promotes more efficient and timely interventions and puts the needs of affected households first. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Agus na sérim Sir Martina Anderson hon ceint I now call Martina Anderson.
Going me agad a last can collier, but while I'm Lord Falver and Ruan Shaw and you, I'd like to speak in favour of the motion. Akarja, unadopted roads have plagued every one of our constituencies, as you could hear here today, for decades, because as this notion and this motion notes, there has been systematic failure in the current process for adopting roads, and I know that's something that the Minister has inherited. None of us are strangers to horror stories of housing estates, both old and new, with potholed roads, manholes and sewage raised several inches from the ground, flooding, poor drainage and backup sewage too. And yet, despite this issue being well rehearsed and affecting every constituency in every city and every town and every village, the Department for Infrastructure, as the motion also notes, seems no closer to resolving it. We have 2,991 unadopted roads right across the north. The bonds value almost £101.5 million. In my own constituency in Derry City and Strapan District Council has 206 roads awaiting adoption to the value of £12.5 million. None of us are any strangers to hearing things like the value of the roads bonds is too low to incentivise developers, or there's no enforcement measures ever taken against what some people describe as rogue developers. There are families who bought their dream homes more than 10 years ago, and yet they're still living in darkness because they still don't have any street lights. In Derry, in the barley fields in Clonmore, my constituents took out choco house mortgages, I can tell you, and they have to haul full bins of right up a steep hill to get them collected because the council collection service are unable to drive on unadopted roads. Now, thankfully, after myself and Sinn Féin councillor Sandra Duffy intervening, the developer has confirmed in writing their intention to achieve full adoption of the top of the barley fields by the end of June. But for those at the bottom, they still have to drag their full bins up a steep hill, which is absolutely impossible for anyone with a disability. In the Waterside and Woodside estates, I had to intervene with the developers, with DFI Roads, with NI Water, to push to get roads finished to an acceptable standard and to fix horrific sewage blockage 10 years after the estate was built. In Sandale Park on the Lenamore Road, I have a small group of constituents who are forced to live in darkness after the Department for Infrastructure, instead of fixing their street lights outright, saw fit to take them down and took down all of the street lights upon discovering that the road was not adopted. Now, the developer built those roads over 50 years ago, and he isn't here to pick up the pieces or the tab. So this is not just a small problem that a few configurations of the road bonds issue is going to fix. It will require decisive action and, if needed, not just the threat of enforcement, but actual enforcement against what some people view as rogue developers. The current planning review, there's an opportunity there, I think, to address this, and if needed, consideration should be given to include a clause which prevents developers from moving from an estate to another part of an estate until they can reasonably demonstrate that the roads, streetlights and sewage are of adequate standard to be adopted and maintained. Minister, you know that buying a home is a massive investment, as has been said, as well as renting a home in these estates, so it's vital that people get what they pay for. We need to end the culture of some developers, thankfully not all, jumping to the next most lucrative venture before bringing roads up to scratch. We need to stop developers abandoning estates for decades before returning to fix issues only after representatives like myself and others, we all press them to do the right thing. And we need to ensure that those estates and homes built 30, 40 and 50 years ago that have no developers to pick up the tab, that they are also not abandoned. Minister, a road to drive on, a footpath to walk on, streetlights to illuminate our neighbourhoods. I think that you would agree all of that isn't too much to ask. Go míle meagah, thank you, and I want to apologise to the Speaker for my noisy watch. I had to put it on airport mode. I didn't think I would have to do that in Stormont.
You never know what's flying about here, Martina. I now call George Robinson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, in recent years, and in common with other areas of Northern Ireland, there have been a number of issues where quite a number of roads have remained unadopted, and requests have had to be made for bonds to be used to sort out these issues on new developments. Over the 9 years since the DRD report, there are still Northern Ireland-wide problems. Minister, immediate action is required to address these systemic problems. The failings identified by the 2012 report have a very real and stressful impact for those who have to deal with poor infrastructure in new developments. It is often a case of months, if not years, before a final resolution can be achieved. I would also point out, Minister, that such problems may see residents in a situation where the problems can be a negative impact on their property price. It is essential that a hard and fast time limit is established to ensure that problems are rectified as a matter of urgency. Mr Deputy Speaker, there is also an issue to do with the level of bonds required. I am aware of a situation where a developer went out of business, but the bond placed was not sufficient to cover the cost of the road finishing required. As the motion states, there must be a system which is ensuring appropriate bond levels to complete works. There should be no major impact on public finances due to an inadequate bond. Mr Deputy Speaker, any changes as proposed in the 2012 report must be a timetable for the time-constrained package of guidance and enforcement. This ensures that residents affected by road and service adoption have a timeline that they can be assured will be adhered to. It is also essential that this package of measures is enforceable by the Minister's department, otherwise they are pointless and cause additional frustrations. Minister, I would also ask if you could look at how progress and possibly financial assistance could be given to people who have purchased former MOD homes. I want to mention the former MOD housing sites associated with the former Shackleton Barracks in my East Londonderry constituency, where there has been a long-running issue with the roads and other services not meeting adoption standards, and taking into consideration families purchased these properties on the understanding, rightly or wrongly, that eventually the department would take over the adoption process a few years ago, but this has never materialised, much to the disappointment and frustration of those residents. I fully appreciate that full funding is not available from your department, but could some investigation be done into a collaborative approach between the Executive, residents and the MOD to try to break the deadlock, and top quality infrastructure can be delivered to all residents of Northern Ireland? I would hope a collaborative approach would see a positive result for residents. Thank you. Finished. Thank you.
Sir Liz Kimmins on Canchai call. Liz Kimmins.
And I too welcome the opportunity to speak on this important issue today and not to hopefully go over all the same points that have been raised, but I certainly hope that it will help to raise the plight of so many residents across the north, and I think it's safe to say that there's not one of us in this chamber who hasn't come across someone affected by this. I think we do need to see a greater focus on reviewing the current processes in order to address the significant backlogs in particular and to improve this process going forward. As others have said, there are currently 2,991 road bonds in private developments yet to be adopted across the north, with 263 of those in Newry Down, which I represent part of, and those are worth approximately £8.2 million. And this means that many residents are living in developments which they have invested thousands of pounds in their home on substandard roads without access to the basic services that others have mentioned, such as bin collections, winter service, street cleaning and street lights. And in some cases, an example in my own constituency, where for over 8 years what can only be described as a dirt track for residents of a development of over 100 houses had to endure until pressure was put on that developer to address it. So I suppose there are a number of factors which have led to this situation, and I know other members have mentioned the property crash in 2007 and how it clearly has exacerbated this issue, and there remains a significant number of older backlogs as a result of this. The inquiry that we talked about has provided a number of recommendations, some of which have been helpful in looking at how we can improve the current system. And part of the inquiry looked at the adequacy of bonds, especially where they weren't enough to carry out the remedial works required. And this is something that needs to be addressed in a proportionate way, as we do appreciate that this could also affect costs to homeowners. As others have mentioned too, the impact of Tory austerity has played a huge role in this, as we see the reduction in staff numbers, particularly as we note the loss of experienced private street inspectors and how this has impacted on the department's capacity to take enforcement action. And this is clearly evidenced in the figures, which show that the number of bonds are increasing and the number of cases, enforcement cases, are decreasing. So whilst I appreciate that enforcement action is a last resort, there are serious issues arising, particularly in relation to what the department considers as dealing with this in a timely manner, for encouraging developers to take action and to call in the bond. And this is something that could be potentially looked at as part of the review, and maybe we could look at a time constraint in order to do that, which might help to address this. So rather than going over the same points that everyone has raised, I fully support this motion, and I think we do need to commit to looking at ways to further improve the system and tackle the backlog of unadopted roads, so that we can deliver fairness and equality for all those residents across the north who have invested in their home and are entitled to receive the basic services that they are currently unable to access due to this long-standing issue.
I call Rosemary Barton.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity to speak in this motion this afternoon. Unadopted roads are a major issue in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, from developments left uncompleted in the financial crisis in 2008 in the numerous towns and villages, causing the problem that roads within the development cannot be adopted by DFI as they are not completed to the necessary standard for adoption. Completed houses in the uncompleted developments were sold, the original contractor became bankrupt, and eventually many of the developments were repossessed by the financial institutions. In other cases, continuing work towards the completion of a development was halted overnight for financial reasons, and the housing development sometimes became a hub for unsocial activity within these unfinished buildings. Further, residents living within these uncompleted developments have to haul out their bins to the entrance of the developments for the refuse collections. Street lights frequently remain unfixed and sometimes unconnected, while footpaths have been left in an unfinished state and also dangerous. As time has passed in some uncompleted developments, issues within the road foundations emerge. The surface cracks indicating that the roads may have not been built to the specified standards. Meanwhile, the network of sewage pipes become displaced and consequently the sewers become blocked, etc. Galgay Shore development in Enniskillen is one such development, and I make no apologies for mentioning it. It is public knowledge about this development. Northern Ireland Water is unable to adopt the private sewage system because the developer is no longer trading, and as such the system remains in possession of the bank. The houses had received planning permission and passed building control regulations which allowed them to be sold on. It was only after the developer was declared bankrupt that residents discovered the developer had not met the legal obligations for the sewage system to be adopted, which meant they are legally liable for the repairs, which will include the unadopted roadway. Meanwhile, because of the health issues, the Northern Ireland Water has been very kind and has helped to clear blockages and provided a tanker to remove sewage, but has said this service, they cannot keep on providing this service. Yes, sir.
I thank the member for giving way, because water and sewage is a particular problem in some areas with developers. But has the member experienced where you have a number of developers on the one side, so one gets planning permission, then subcontracts, somebody else builds and somebody else sells, and they each take a cut, but they reduce the standard in terms of the infrastructure?
Members, next minute.
Thank you. Indeed, I've come across that in several of the developments. It's happening quite frequently. Yeah. The National House Building Council, which provides warranties for new homes, said, while we appreciate this is a difficult situation for the Galgay Shore residents, the NHBC Buildmark warranty cover does not extend to the rectification of the sewage system and the poor road foundations. Mr Deputy Speaker, as I see it, the main issue for the completion of these uncompleted developments and consequently the unadopted roads is that of the value of the road bond that the original developer surrendered to DFI. This is no longer suffice for the completion of the developments and bringing them up to the required standards. It is therefore essential that DFI treat this matter of unadopted roads with some urgency and review this whole system of bonds and the supervision of the various stages of work within developments. Further, a method has to be developed for enforcement against developers and within DFI for prioritising and getting the present unadopted developments and roads completed. Thank you.
And I call Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. An unadopted road is one where street planning function has been exercised, a bond has been placed under the Private Streets Northern Ireland Order in 1980, and the Department is not satisfied that the street has been sewered, levelled, paved, channelled and made good and lighted. An unadopted road is also one where people live, where people don't have appropriate sewage, where footpaths are trip hazards, where secondary drainage is often appalling, leading to terrible flooding, where manhole covers stand proudly in the centre of the road, and where people have to drag their laden bins quite some distance to the main road where the local council's refuse collection is made. In my own constituency, there are a number of developments where roads are unadopted. In some of those areas, the developer has all but abandoned the people who bought or rent homes there. In one case, the development has been built on a steep hill and remains unadopted after a number of years. The road surface is left in a mess, residents are distraught, and the developer has not been taken to task. This is one example where I have to ask why the department has not utilised the bond to put right the mess this developer has left people with. Those families cannot sell their homes to move somewhere else, where their bins can be collected and where they can walk along their development's footpath without fear of trips or slips, or where children can play safely under streetlights. More determined and focused intervention needs to be taken to ensure developers do not walk away, that they do not abandon residents for years, or that they do not expect residents or even the department to pick up the pieces. There is a reason a bond is required. The bond should be used a lot quicker, and that all developers are aware if they do not make good, their bond will be used. The bond needs to be of enough value to meet costs, not at today's costs, but future costs. How much will it be to adopt that road in, say, 5 years or 10 years? On the department's website, it states, prior to construction, a developer is required to enter into an agreement with DFI Roads to provide the roads, footways and sewers to the department's standards prescribed in Private Streets Construction Regulations NI 1994. This agreement is secured by a bond that may be used by DFI Roads to complete the roadworks should the developer default. The department's own website confirms if the road has not been completed to the required standard for adoption 1 year from the date on which the buildings were first occupied, then notice will be sent to the responsible person to require completion of works. In my constituency, this doesn't happen. Years go by before developers complete a road. They use the excuse their site is not yet finished. They have more phases yet to come, all while residents live without their bins being able to be collected near their home, to live with dangerous footpaths, and surface flooding continues. Residents are at their wits' end. I ask the Minister of Infrastructure to please end the torture some residents face. Use the bond much more quickly to ensure unadopted roads are brought up to a standard to be adopted. I will happily bring the Minister to a development in Killalay with me, and the Minister can see for herself that there are beautiful homes, but they are surrounded by unfinished and entirely unsuitable access roads. Minister, we've heard today how few staff you have to enable effective enforcement. So let's use innovation. Is there anything councils can do to help you? Is there enough of a threat to stop rogue developers abandoning residents just so they can go on to their next project? For example, I will indeed.
Would the member agree with me that it would be very reasonable to have higher bond rates from those developers who have proven track records of abandoning property and not putting in place due appropriate roads and sewage infrastructure?
Members next a minute.
I hopefully won't need it, Deputy Speaker. I agree with Mr Beggs. I actually think that any developer that misses targets should not be allowed to apply for reduced bonds in the future as well. Developers are leaving people high and dry. Some, of course, may go into bankruptcy. We've seen that happen over the last number of years. But it's the residents, the people who are paying money, who are actually paying rates, that are being let down. We have to get innovative. I know your budget is tough, Minister. I don't envy you at all. But honestly, Killalay, those residents are examples of people that we have across Northern Ireland. And if I have to watch one of the residents again pull 20 bins down to a road that's about half a mile long and it's a steep hill, honestly, this isn't good enough. It is a big job of work for your department. The bonds are there. Please use them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, members. And just before we move to call the Minister, I've been informed that Mr Robinson had a recent big birthday. So, George, on behalf of us all the very best. And we should say it's probably a road well travelled and well adopted, that one, George. So, all the very best to you, George, and many more of them. Okay. Agus neis éireann sé ar an éire on freigrí a chóirt don díosparach. I now call the Minister to respond to the debate. And the Minister is up to 15 minutes, I should say.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I would like to add my birthday best wishes to Mr Robinson as well, and I would like to thank the Chairperson of the Committee for Infrastructure for raising this debate on unadopted roads. This is, as every member who has spoken rightly highlighted, an important issue that affects so many people right across the North. And as a Minister for Infrastructure, I am focused on improving the lives of people across Northern Ireland. I've listened very carefully to the views expressed by members, and I recognise their genuine comments on behalf of their constituents. I also completely understand and recognise the frustration shared across this House that we are sitting with a committee report produced in 2012, and despite there being successive ministers, and as Ms Kelly highlighted, and I think Mr Muir, we did have 3 years without any government or ministers in place, so of course all of that has contributed to the slow pace of change on this issue. And I also recognise, as members have highlighted, that it is a very special moment in your life when you rent a home, when you buy your home, and that should be a very positive experience. And it's not right that for many people for quite some time it hasn't been a positive experience because of the reasons that members have articulated. While my department manages the adoption of roads and new developments, it is important to acknowledge, as a number of members have, that this is primarily a developer-led process, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is equally important to recognise that in most instances, developers act responsibly and their developments are completed and adopted without the need for any interventions from my department. However, as we have heard today, where a developer does commence work without having the necessary road agreement and bond in place, I can confirm that my department will take action against that developer. Equally, where a developer fails to complete road infrastructure in a new development, my department will adopt a phased approach to intervention that is appropriate for the individual circumstances. Where a developer is still trading and seems to be progressing their development, albeit slower than some residents might like, my officials will firstly engage with the developer and encourage them to complete the outstanding works in a timely manner. My department's private streets inspectors will also monitor the developer's progress. Should a developer ultimately fail to progress their development, my department will issue an enforcement notice under the Private Streets Order 1980 requiring the completion of the roadworks. If the developer fails to comply with this notice or is no longer trading, my department can complete the outstanding roadworks and then adopt the road into the public road network. I recognise the very important role that my department's private streets inspectors play in this process. But as members right across this House have rightly identified, the voluntary exit scheme has half the number of officers that I have who are able to carry out this role. It was made clear at the time that this would have an impact on services, and unfortunately the resource budget allocated to my predecessor, Danny Kennedy, and the cuts that ensued has had an impact not only in this area but, as members across this House will know because they passionately represent their constituents, it has had an impact on services right across my department, and that is a reality within which we have to operate. But I am very heartened that in the committee's motion today it rightly recognises that difficulty and that has been also reiterated by committee members and other members. So I do look forward to working with the committee as we try to address that in terms of the resource allocations to my department, particularly with the first opportunity presenting itself in June. Of course.
Thank the Minister for taking an intervention. Just in relation to an issue that Martine Anderson raised also is the historical, the legacy issue where there are no developers any longer here that will be able to meet the requirements. And some of these developments were actually built by council, by the old legacy councils, and taken on by Housing Executive without ever being adopted. And I have actually 2 of those in my immediate area of Coal Island. And I know that there are many, many more across Mid-Ulster, as I'm sure the Deputy Speaker can attest to. But that's a real issue, and it is an equality issue. And we built those houses, government built those houses, and government needs to fix it.
I thank the member for her intervention, and she is correct to point out the legacy sites and the difficulties that are ensuing. And my department is, even within the resource constraints that I've just outlined, is trying to take a proactive approach in terms of tackling those legacy sites and trying to take a prioritised approach, working with Northern Ireland Water as well. I just want to point out that in respect of kind of the agreements and bonds from developers, there is an issue, as members have rightly identified, about the level of bonds. And I want to very clearly state today that I recognise that is a difficulty as Minister, and so I have asked my officials to carry out a review of how we calculate bonds, because the fact is that we haven't changed the calculation of bonds since 2008. And so that review will take place. I think it was Mr Boylan who had asked around the terms of reference for that. So it will be reviewing the construction costs to ensure that bonds are able to cover that, and it will be working with a range of stakeholders as well within the construction industry, but right across the board, and of course the committee will be kept updated on that process. As I said, I want to reassure you that I am committed to ensuring that construction rates are used to calculate our road bonds, and that fully reflects the cost of constructing roads in new developments, an issue that Kelly Armstrong and others had raised, and hopefully that will give residents some sense of peace of mind. But it was Mr Beggs, I think, and Ms Kelly in particular, who had emphasised the importance of the legal profession in trying to find solutions to this issue. And progress has been made in terms of a greater level of awareness of the responsibilities when it comes to providing conveyancing advice, and also a greater level of public awareness about the issue of bonds and agreements being in place when solicitors are advising people on the purchase of their new homes. So in that sense, many people who are buying into new residential developments will have much greater protection than previously was the case. Before I move on to address some of the very specific points that members had raised, I go back to the point that was raised in the intervention by Ms Dillon about legacy sites. And as members have highlighted, there are legacy sites right across Northern Ireland that remain unadopted. And as members have also rightly identified, a lot of this emanated from the property crash of 2007. And there are often very complex sewage and road problems that are affecting their adoption, Mr Speaker. Although my department has made some progress in recent years adopting a number of these legacy sites, as Mr Moore highlighted, I am keen to provide a fresh impetus to this process, and so I am committed to ensuring that my officials in roads and Northern Ireland Water continue to work proactively to address a number of legacy developments towards adoption, with intervention prioritised on the basis of need. A number of members had talked about the 2012 committee report and a series of very helpful recommendations that come from that, and a number of members have identified that progress has been made in terms of the implementation of some of those recommendations. If I could just very quickly run through a number of those. We've talked about the conveyancing advice and a greater level of awareness there. My department had engaged with the Law Society on that particular issue. There is also a recommendation in the committee motion about ensuring that we have a much more robust set of guidance. Members may be aware that there was new private streets procedures guidance updated in 2014, and that was circulated to all staff in respect of private streets matters. But as we have said, the reality of the voluntary exit scheme, the reality of cuts to the resource budget to the department has impacted on the level of staffing there, which is something that I would be keen to address. The committee motion also talks about a code of practice to kind of trigger broader enforcement, and I hope the committee members are aware. I think the chair highlighted this, that Northern Ireland Water has introduced a monitoring system to speed up the timescales for adoption of sewage infrastructure, and that is by monitoring the progress of bonds through the adoption process. And so that's enabling them to take a much more proactive approach to the process rather than the previous developer-led scheme. And so that should help us to identify much earlier on sites where development has stalled, and therefore should lead to quicker enforcement action. I think it was Ms Kelly talked about the importance of having clarity of roles, and she spoke about the role of local government, as a number of other members have. One of the recommendations in that committee report was that property certificates should be adapted to include the legal opinion as to the condition of the roads and sewers. Since then, as part of the reform of local government, responsibility for property certificates has passed to the councils, with the Property Certificates Unit in Fermanagh and Omagh District Council, and that provides a service on behalf of all the councils. This responsibility includes the production of new service level agreements with their property certificate consultees, and the Property Certificate Unit within Fermanagh and Omagh District Council has initiated work on reviewing the questions in the property certificates, and this work is ongoing. So there are some positive actions being taken, but as members say, this is a hugely challenging issue. Mr Buchanan had raised the issue of private streets legislation, and in his view there should be a wholesale review and reform of that piece of legislation. Officials have said that in their assessment it generally is adequate and fit for purpose, and that this is supported by other key stakeholders, including the Construction Employers Federation, the National House Building Council, and the Law Society in the course of the review, but I would be keen to hear the committee's view on that as well. And then one of the other issues that was rightly identified in the committee report back in 2012 was about the loophole where a developer could choose not to enter into a bond or agreement. Clause 6 of the Water and Sewerage Services Act in 2016, made by the Assembly on the 23rd of March 2016, has closed this loophole. So again, another positive step forward, but in saying that, I still recognise that there is still a lot of work to do. I think it was Ms Anderson and Mr Boylan that talked about the planning review and how we can better, join up our planning system with this particular issue. The review of the Planning Act, and we've received a number of submissions on that, Mr Deputy Speaker, and all of the issues that have been raised within that, and we let it be open for people to be able to raise the stakeholders any of the concerns that they have. So all of those issues that have been raised will be examined, and obviously be keen to keep the committee updated on that as well. Just Mr Begg's referenced about the real financial challenges facing the department, and he's absolutely right, and we need to be real when we're talking about what we can do and provide in terms of service levels and staffing levels. He did mention Lauren Road. I see he's not in his seat, so I'm happy to follow that up with him. He has raised that particular issue with me through Assembly questions and correspondence. Mr Muir rightly talked about the responsibility of developers, and we shouldn't lose sight of that in the middle. Government should be only stepping in when things have got wrong. We should really make sure that it never gets to that stage in the first instance, through the conveyancing advice, through enforcement, and also working proactively with developers as well. And Ms Anderson, Ms Barton and Kelly Armstrong, right across, have identified particular issues in their location, and I don't underestimate the impact on families of having to live with this regard. I am pleased, though, that some members have been able to report progress by working with developers, and I would be very keen that we do that, because it is finding a resolution in the quickest possible time frame. But of course, where necessary, we as a department need to be stepping in and taking enforcement action. Mr Deputy Speaker, and just closing, I just want to thank all of the members for contributing to today's debate, for the committee chair and the committee itself for bringing forward a very constructive motion. I will keep them updated on our work to review the levels of bonds, and also look forward to working with them as we hopefully try to address the resource difficulties facing the department.
And I now call the Deputy Chair of the committee, David Hilditch, to conclude and wind the debate. And Mr Hilditch, you have up to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy-Speaker, and can I also thank those who have contributed and participated in the debate this evening. We've seen a wide range of issues right across Northern Ireland. Every constituency from the west right through to Strangford, they have all the same problems that are occurring. We've heard those given out on the floor today. And I also thank the Minister for her attendance and contribution this afternoon, and welcome some of the statements she has made there in relation to outstanding works and also the bonds at construction costs. Mr Deputy Speaker, 10 years ago the figures relating to unadopted roads were stark. Anything between 1,200 and 3,500 unadopted roads and some 1,200 sewage systems being identified in backlog, with over 620 kilometres of unadopted road and laneways that sit outside the private streets process. While progress has been made, a worrying amount still remains to be done, some of it dating back as far as 2007. Perhaps most worryingly, Northern Ireland Water and the Department of Infrastructure have yet to detail precise numbers for affected sites. We have all heard individual examples of real situations affecting real families, and each of these deserves remedy. We have heard today how problems have been exacerbated by low staff levels and loss of key skills in the department, and that to get back to a proactive enforcement model and to be in a better place to know the number of sites and levels of occupancy, we need to go back to 2015 pre-reduction levels. Much has also been said about the 2012 report of the Regional Development Committee and the recommendations it made for remedial action to address the backlog and legacy sites. Yet we have also heard of how little seems to have been achieved in almost a decade since the report was published. The committee believes there are still issues to be addressed around bonds. The 2012 report recommended that statutory providers and representatives of the construction and financial sectors agree a bond level that is acceptable to all parties and which includes an inflationary amount.
Yet we hear that to this day there are still sites without bonds and sites where delays and inflationary increases mean the bond is no longer held in a sufficient way to bring works up to a suitable standard of adoption. The committee still has concerns around prompt triggering of bond enforcement and suggests a review of whether the use of the 80% occupancy rate is really the best measure of when adoption should be triggered. It also believes a review of the departmental procedures with a view to ensuring a prompt reaction to calling in the bond is still valid today in order to alleviate public health and safety risk to residents. We have heard and welcome that there has been engagement with the Law Society, but more can still be done. What progress has been made to fully implement adopting property certificates to include legal opinion on the condition of roads and sewers, whether these have been adopted, and advising potential vendors of the consequences of non-adoption will have on them. What progress can we make in developing this information guide for vendors? I could go on, Mr Deputy Speaker, about the recommendations made in the report and how the committee's investigations into the current status of this issue reveals the need for each to be revisited and further actioned. But rather than do that, I think it's sufficient to say that there's much work to be done overall. Key to resolving the issue is the need for clearly understand the extent of it and the details of each site that is of concern. The committee welcomes news that Northern Ireland Water is proactively trying to identify high priority and legacy sites and establish what the problems are at each, and that the Department is working with them to get this completed, which is long overdue. The committee acknowledges that there are instances where enforcement cannot be used to guide the works, typically where there are land issues and access issues, and that in these instances there is a need to try and work out with developers and residents a way to move forward and resolve outstanding issues. Is there a way of moving further forward the cooperation forum recommended previously? It is the belief of the committee that no stone can be left unturned in seeking ways to address these issues and address the backlog, particularly in the older outstanding cases. In closing, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think it is worth reiterating the call this motion makes on the Minister of Infrastructure. That is to take urgent steps to identify the extent of and reduce the backlog of unadopted roads and services. Given the ongoing constraints on the Department resource budget and its implications, to work with the Executive College to identify where cross-departmental working could help address the issue, and to examine again the recommendations made in the 2012 report with a view to formulating and implementing a time-constrained package of guidance and enforcement that includes ensuring adequate bond levels and review of the statutory instruments. Yes, there are still a number of issues outstanding. The Committee of Infrastructure, just like the Regional Development Committee before it, believes that this and actions must be identified and taken to rectify this problem, and that a coordinated effort by all sectors involved in the process could see major improvements in even the most critical cases. I commend the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, members. The question is that the motion standing on the order paper be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the motion is passed. If members just take their ease while we move to the next item of business, please.
We haven't got 10 in the chamber for voting. Okay, that's okay. Order, members. I would ask members to resume their seat. Order. The next item of business is the introduction of Integrated Education Bill, and I call Kelly Armstrong to move the first stage.
I beg to introduce the Integrated Education Bill.
Clerk, please read the long title.
A bill to make provision about integrated education and for connected purposes.
And that constitutes the first reading, first stage of the bill, and it shall now be printed. That's page 21. The next item on the order paper is the adjournment. The question is that the Assembly do now adjourn, and in conjunction with the Business Committee, the Speaker has given leave to Emma Sheeran to raise the matter of street lighting in rural areas of mid-Ulster. But the member is not present. I'd ask members to take their ease just for a short moment. Doesn't turn up. Again, just to reiterate, the Speaker has given leave to Ms Emma Sheeran to raise the matter of street lighting in rural areas of mid-Ulster. The proposer of the topic will have 15 minutes. And so I now call Emma Sheeran.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and can I put on record my appreciation to the Minister for this and my apologies for taking so long in getting here. And I want to thank the Speaker for allowing this matter, this adjournment debate today. I have often said that issues of connectivity, as a rural representative, are the things that are brought to us most often by constituents, whether that be health issues, roads and broader infrastructure issues, telecommunications, anything that our constituents face barriers when trying to access are brought to us incredibly often, and they're the things that matter most to the people that we represent. And street lighting is one of the issues that I know I have brought to the Minister on a lot of occasions, and we work a lot with the local DFI officials, who I have to say are brilliant, but I do feel that the policy that we currently have isn't fit for purpose and isn't best serving the rural populations that we represent. And the criteria to try and get street lighting in a rural area, whereby you need 10 properties, all of which have an independent entrance out onto the road within a 200-metre space, it makes this difficult. So I have a lot of examples, and I know that I've written both to the Minister about this and about the policy, and also working locally with Martin Curran from our local division, who has been at various site meetings with me, and I think he's exasperated an awful lot of the time. One of the examples that I have raised on countless occasions now is the patch of road between Straw and Dripperstown. In my own back garden, it's very local to me and is a walking route for the population of Ballinasgreen. Our football club is located in Straw, which is about a mile or less than that from the town. You have a good enough population in the town of Dripperstown, and that would be a link and a walking and cycling route for people. We've got a great new walking route around the two of the pitches in the club, and you would see people year-round using that walking route. And obviously we live in Ireland. For half the year you've got darkness falling 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and therefore it's not fit for purpose in the evening time for most of the year. And I would use this walking route myself. Obviously we've seen during COVID people have relied on getting out and about for their mental health, and for obviously we know the benefits of physical health for our own mental well-being. And you meet people coming with wee headlamps on because that's the safest way of getting about. And I have had countless requests for street lighting. It's a very small patch of road that isn't lit up, but it means that there is a safety issue there. Other examples, and again I've been working with local officials around this, the Maherfelt Road, as it's called, coming out of Castledawson, heading to the Castledawson roundabout. Now again, you've got a dedicated walking and cycle track there, which is brilliant, recently resurfaced. You've got bollards along the middle of the path, and people will collide into those bollards because there's no lighting whatsoever, and again it doesn't meet the criteria. But it would be a link route and would allow people to come from Castledawson in over the roundabout and into Maherfelt, and would provide that outside amenity for people that can't be used because of the lack of street lighting and the safety issue that presents. Another example in the Loop, the Ballyneal Road in the Loop, where again the football club's located, and would be a walking route for people from the village, from the houses and basically the main centre of the parish of the Loop out to the football club, and they can't use it for most of the year because there's no street lighting and it's not safe. And obviously you have cars flying past, and people, if they're wanting to walk their children training and maybe dander back themselves, and they can't do that for a big portion of the year. We have the Crew Road in Mahara. My colleague, Councillor Brian McGuigan, has worked hard on getting that designated as a highway to health route, and you've got a great circle basically in Mahara, which again this year during lockdown you've seen people using that every day. And there's just one small section of the road that has no street lighting, and it's the break in the chain. So people would come down the station road and out and go on to the Crew Road, and they can't use it after evening time for most of the year because there's no street lighting. I've also, Councillor Donald McPeak and myself have had Martin Curran out in Ballymwigan, and the stretch of road, it will be the shore road between St Trey's Primary School up to the houses, where there's no street lighting, and again it's a break, and it means that there's a barrier to safety there for people that want to use the facility. So I know that working with departmental officials, and they're doing their best, and I know the last time that we had a debate in this chamber about sort of road safety in Mid-Ulster, and I'm sure it could apply across the north, that you'll find these issues are being brought to you time and time again because they affect people's everyday life, and it's a source of massive frustration. But I know that the officials that we're working with are doing the best that they can. It's the policy that I feel needs to be changed, and obviously that policy has been in place since 2012, and I would like to see some adaptation to it where you could even take it that you'll look at things on a case-by-case basis. And so whilst you have to bear in mind, light pollution and sort of acknowledging and preserving the rural aspect of a particular place. The places that I'm listing there, particularly the likes of between Straw and Draperstown, locals in Ballinscreen don't see that as rural compared to the rural road that I live on. That is an extension of the town that people regard as such and would use as such, and that bit of lighting wouldn't be a barrier for people. They would welcome it. And I just think that if we could adapt the thing and look at it on a sort of more sensible basis, to take things on a case-by-case and look at the number of people that are using the road on a daily basis and see would the safety aspect of this be enhanced if there was lighting. So that's all from me, Gormagat. Thank you.
Can I advise subsequent speakers that they will have up to 10 minutes? And I call Keith Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And first of all, I'd like to start by thanking the member for raising this important issue on the virtual tour of Ulster, which is very good for the Minister's benefit. I was actually learning some places myself there. It's very informative. So thank you for that. The importance of rural lighting, street lighting, cannot be understated. It provides a number of benefits to constituents. Street lighting promotes Security in the rural areas, which the member has said, increases the quality of life by artificially extending daylight hours and improves road safety for all. It is my understanding that the Department uses two main criteria when considering the provision of street lighting in rural areas. These are the density of housing within a community, including public buildings with significant night-time use and road safety, where street lighting would contribute to a reduction in the number of night-time collisions. We have been contacted by constituents in our rural areas to improve street lighting. The changing, as the member has said, the changing of the criteria set out by the Department would provide more positive than negatives in individual cases. Street lighting on rural roads improves the safety for drivers, riders, cyclists and pedestrians alike. According to the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, 40% of fatal and serious injuries in the United Kingdom occur between the hours of 7 p.m. and 8 a.m, despite only a quarter of all travel happening in this time frame. Between 2013 and 2017, 229 people were killed or seriously injured in Mid-Ulster. This is an average of 45 road traffic collisions a year. In 2017, Mid-Ulster accounted for over 6.5% of road traffic collisions in Northern Ireland, despite accounting for 5.5% of the total population. Evidence has found that increasing rural street lighting will decrease the amount of both fatal and non-fatal RTCs on motorways. 2.6% of accidents are fatal where street lighting is present, compared to 4.3% of accidents where it is not. On built-up roads, 1.3% of accidents are fatal where street lighting is present, compared to 1.9% of accidents where it is not. Similarly, on non-built-up roads, 3.1% of accidents are fatal in lit conditions, rising to 4.9% in areas without street lights. The increasing of rural street lighting in Mid-Ulster promotes security for people that live there. In the past, they have become more aware of antisocial behaviour in the smaller villages around the constituency. The darker side of humanity comes out onto the shadows and can become more sinister in nature. In many of those occasions, most people in those areas have requested bad lighting, and obviously some people carrying out crimes and antisocial behaviour can sort of hide in the shadows. At this time, I would like to welcome the transition to the new LED lighting in Mid-Ulster. The benefits of the new LED lights are clear to see, if you pardon the pun. These new LED lights, provide a brighter and cleaner lighting to our rural towns and villages, and are a welcome sight to behold in comparison to the dulling, orange or sodium street lights, as they're known as, that we have become too accustomed to. The new LED lighting is far more environmentally friendly. They do not contain lead or mercury. The LED lights reduce light pollution. The lights are more focused and project a more accurate colour rendering. Obviously, some people would be concerned about less of a spread of the lights, and whatever your Martin Kernan has done changes, for example, you'll get complaints, but I think that's the newness of the thing. And obviously, if there's a new system, your centres will be somewhat different. So some people have negative vibes, but I think that's only for the change. The financial benefits of the new LED lighting scheme is also very important to highlight. The estimated annual saving of the implementation of the LED lighting scheme is around £906,000 per year. This money saved can now be spent where it is needed, and most both in our constituents as a wider society here in Northern Ireland, and obviously some of that saving could be spent in some of the areas that my colleague for Mid-Ulster has requested. And I again thank the member for bringing this debate to the Chamber, and I wish to hear your remarks. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I call Patsy McGlone.
Thanks very much indeed, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing the debate to the Chamber here today. It's very important, and just following on from the debate we had earlier about undeveloped roads, indeed many instances do occur where, through the neglect of a developer, street lights can't be provided within some of those estates and some of those extended footways and stuff, and that creates a further problem in itself. Now, I would like to place firmly on record too my thanks to Martin Curran, who during my time both as councillor and indeed as MLA, he has been prompt and efficient at getting back, sometimes in difficult circumstances, whenever there have been issues where, say for example, there's been lights out in a housing estate, and I can think one where a young mother had died, and in order to facilitate the wake, he moved very promptly to get that dealt with, and that did give some wee bit of relief to the family at that time. So my thanks in particular to Martin there. The SDLP has lobbied successive ministers on the provision of street lighting and on the need to maintain and repair existing lighting. Of course, that requires investment, and I want to thank the Minister especially for the recently completed street lighting to the flyover on the Tobermore Road in Mahara. It's been It's an issue that has been raised repeatedly by local constituents, and the lighting itself has been widely welcomed in the area. My party colleague in Mid-Ulster, Councillor Christine McFlynn, has been lobbying recently for street lighting to be provided in Mountview and Moneymore to link a new-built housing estate to the town, and also in Manor Park. The footpath there has been extended, but the contractor, unfortunately, as I say, hasn't extended the lighting. Such street lighting improves safety for local residents. It can help otherwise isolated new-built housing estates feel part of an established community. Road safety is, of course, greatly improved by the provision of street lighting, enhancing the visibility for all those driving, cycling, wheeling and walking. We debated road safety issues at schools in Mid-Ulster recently. Lighting around our rural schools was raised as an issue at this time, and it's worth highlighting again. In particular, one of those that have been asked to raise with you is around the Achamullen school in, outside Colleen. That's been raised as a very important issue by local residents. In the winter months especially, it can be very, very difficult, and improving the safety for children going to and from schools at all times of the year should be a priority for all of us as representatives of a rural constituency like Mid-Ulster. The modern LED, which Mr Buchanan referred to, that technology can provide adequate street lighting with improved quality of lighting and better energy efficiency. And I would like to put on record here too, residents from Carnan in the upper part of the Arboe parish have placed their thanks and indeed their acknowledgement of this new form of lighting, as have residents in Glenone at the lower end of the constituency, just quite close to the River Bann in County Antrim. Achieving a target of net zero by at least 2050 will need the adoption of new technology in the provision of vital infrastructure such as street lighting, and it's important that we figure that into our deliberations. I welcome the Minister's commitment to climate action on this and in other areas, and Mid-Ulster is also the proud home of the OM Dark Sky Park and Observatory at Dava Forest Park. It is just the second place on the island of Ireland and the first in the north to be accredited as an international dark sky park. The adoption of new technologies for street lighting must also include new design features that minimise light pollution. If future generations are to be inspired to follow in the footsteps of northern stars like Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the renowned Northern Irish astronomer, who, as I'm sure members will know, discovered the first radio pulsars in 1967. I didn't know that until someone pointed that out to me. We must ensure that we take light pollution as seriously as we do other environmental pollution. All this will require is agreement from the Finance Minister and the Executive colleagues for the necessary investment in new technology to upgrade street lighting in Mid-Ulster and right across the north. The existing network of street lighting also needs to be maintained and repaired until they are able to be upgraded too. Previous ministers have cut budgets for this work at times and left some areas of our towns completely in the dark, and that's not that long ago, a couple of years ago. People were ringing constantly, especially pensioners, when it came into the winter months, and they lived in isolated areas, small estates, quiet areas, but they were fearful. Once the lights went out at night, they were very, very fearful. And some towns, indeed, were left completely in the dark. I welcome the Minister's restoration of the budget for this essential work, and we've seen that. I've seen it in my own area in Ballinderry, where within about 12 hours of reporting it to Martin Curran, the team were out at the bridge there with their full gear to carry out and effect those repairs in a very busy point, and actually it's a very busy and at times a wee bit nippy in terms of traffic flows there at that particular location too. And I'll just place on record too, I would like to thank the Department for Infrastructure, following representations to them, for the road surfacing work that's been carried out there at Ballinderry Bridge on the Domini Road as well. And I'm sure Conor will relay that through to the contractors as well. The Infrastructure Minister has made a good start with the schemes we've seen delivered to date, but there's obviously much more to do, as we're hearing here today. I'm sure other members will join me in thanking her for the work that she's done and calling for the Executive to agree for further investment in the modernisation of street lighting in our constituency, which as of itself, that investment can save money. It reduces power and the costs on power. I've already mentioned a number of areas just that the residents have been speaking about for street lighting, like Anaher Road, Colend. The Draperstown Straw area have been approached by that, and the Clady Glenone area. Now, why I highlight those is, now the member has also mentioned the loop, and we met with officials from the Department for Infrastructure there a fortnight ago, Councillor Christine McFlynn and I, to get a footpath in place first. Why I refer to that is there are a number of areas where there are, if you like, developments or indeed assigned villages, very close proximity to one another. I think what those areas be designated, the Straw, Draperstown would be one, but I think also of Clady and Portlanode, where there is at times a short footpath. And because of those designated developments are in relative close proximity, I think if the department could look at that situation, the footpaths are in place, or hopefully about to be in place at the likes of the loop, following our representations, and if where there's a flow of, quite a flow of people, a regular flow of people I would say, and in some instances where the footpath can maybe be a wee bit difficult or dangerous indeed at its age, where the person doesn't have any light, if there is a defined short area of footpath that has been provided and or adopted by the department, I think it would be very worthwhile looking at the criteria for the provision of street lighting at those locations, at the likes of the Glenone to Clady, at the likes of Straw to Draperstown, and hopefully at the likes of the Loop. So on that point, I'll conclude. It has given us a lot of food for thought, and I hope maybe food for thought elsewhere where the money is and where the investment is at the executive. I know there are draws on its time all the time, and we heard them earlier in the debate about unadopted estates where people were suggesting further investment. But on this one, we have road safety, we have safety of pedestrians, particularly youngsters and families who are travelling and traversing back to places of work, back to schools. And finally, on one I would mention is just the potential for that at the Broch outside Castle Dawson. Great work, and we're down recently opening formally the A6. Great to see you there back in the constituency again. And I know your friends and family are not that far away from the Castle Dawson roundabout. Know them well, and I'm sure they were delighted to see you as well. But that A6 is great roadway, brilliant roadway. However, the bridge over from one part of the Broch over to the other part of the Broch, which is a town land that has been divided by the A6. Previously there was street lighting where the existing roadway went. Now there isn't any street lighting. And I would just highlight the dangerous part of that bridge, that footway over at both sides. It's very dark, and there are a lot of people who traverse it from one part of the Broch over to the other part of the Broch where the football St Malachy's pavilion is, the GAA pavilion. Very important if we could get something moved along there in the interests of pedestrian safety. So on that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I conclude, and again I thank the Minister for her intervention on a number of cases that I've raised.
I call Linda Dillon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for coming to this adjournment debate today, and I hope that we will get some results out of it. And obviously we all have our pet projects, for want of a better term. We all have our areas that we want looked at, but the fact is, I think we need to go right back to what was said by my colleague Emma Sheeran at the beginning of this debate. We actually need a change in policy, because we can all want lights wherever we want them, but if the policy doesn't allow it, it's not going to happen. And that's the reality of it. So I do think that we need to look at the policy, and a first step, Minister, in relation to a case-by-case basis, which was something that Emma Sheeran had suggested, is how could we work with Council? Because I can't speak for councils in other areas, but I can speak for the Council in Mid-Ulster, and they're brilliant. They're outstanding whenever it comes. I'm talking about our officers, our councillors, right across the board, in terms of what is good for Mid-Ulster, what is going to benefit the residents of Mid-Ulster, what is strategically beneficial, what will work for us economically, for the benefit of people's lives, for their health, for their mental well-being. Every single facet of life of the people of Mid-Ulster is really valued and really is benefited in terms of what our council does. And as I say, that's right through from our council officers to the councillors themselves, and they work well together to ensure that we do have the best possible life standard of living, rather, right across Mid-Ulster. And we think that that would be a good starting point. It's already been alluded to, where you have dark areas, you will have antisocial behaviour. And, you know, as much as lighting is important around safety, just in terms of being able to safely walk from one place to another, it is important in terms of safety for the residents and guards against that antisocial behaviour. So I do think it's important. Our rural residents, to be fair, feel a wee bit neglected right across the board, Minister, not just by your own department, but infrastructure is a massive part of why they feel neglected in terms of, and we've talked about it before, around access to footpaths. Street lighting is part of that, because very often if you don't have a footpath, the chances of getting street lighting is pretty limited. But we do need the footpaths, we do need the street lighting, we do need to link up areas. We need to link up the likes of Top Clonoe, where I live, to the town of Coal Island via Anaher Road. There's a really good footpath there, implemented and maintained by the department, but with no lighting. So for the biggest part of the year, it's no good to anybody. And it's a really vital access in terms of allowing people from Top Clonoe to get down to the services, which is Fianna Football Club and the shop and everything else that comes with getting closer to the town. So really important. And those people do feel, again, a bit abandoned, because they have that footpath which takes them to Coal Island, but there is no link from Top Clonoe to Bottom Clonoe at all. And we have the same circumstance in many, many other areas. And I do agree with other members when they talk about developers and when they're developing and looking at where footpaths and street lighting are put at that point. You know, we have some really small areas, but close to where I live, where if you had a tiny stretch of footpath with a bit of street lighting, you connect whole areas right to the town. And it's just really, you're talking about a couple of metres in some instances, but it's a couple of metres that actually prevent residents from being able to access services and being able to access the town. And we've talked about mental health and well-being. And again, in rural areas, you know, very often we don't have the benefits of the walking tracks and the different areas which are lit up and which have footpaths to be able to walk, particularly in the evenings. And for all of us who work, it's either 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. Both of those times in particular times of the year are dark. So we really do need to look at where can we put street lighting, where we can put minimal investment but actually create maximum benefit. And I think that is important. I also agree with some of the contributors earlier around that need for looking at what is, you know, how to protect our environment, the type of lighting we put in certain areas. And I know that it's really important to certain individuals, particularly people who have made representations to myself about when we're putting lighting into certain walkways, to really be conscious of what wildlife is in that area and how that light will impact. And it's great to see that people are actually really conscious of that, because it was a time whenever people would have just said, we want lights and all that matters is us. And now people are actually saying, no, we want to protect our surroundings, we want to protect our environment, and I think that's good. And again, I'm not going to go over the points made by other members around the benefits of the LED lighting, because I mean that's just plain to be seen in every possible way, and not least in terms of finances. And I mean, I know that finances are an issue, and I accept that they're an issue for every single department. They're an issue for this executive and this assembly, because we do have very finite resource, and we have a very finite resource, not because our executive doesn't want to give all our ministers money to do whatever they want, because we are relying on a British government to give us money. I don't want to be in that circumstance. I would much prefer to see that we had a complete control over our own finances. I certainly wouldn't like to be going with a begging bowl in order to pay my bills in my house. I like to be in control of my finances, decide what my priorities are, decide how I spend my money and what bills I pay first. I think this executive should be in the same position, and you, Minister, I think should be in that position in terms of being able to deliver all of the things that we talked about in the debate earlier, what we're talking about here this evening. I would love us to be in control of our own destiny. So I will not go over all of the points that have already been made, but I would like to say that this is something that really could, as I say, in terms of changing the policy and working with local council, we could make a real difference to the lives of the people across Mid-Ulster, not least in our very rural and isolated areas. Gormail, my love.
I now call on the Minister for Infrastructure, Nicola Mallon, to respond to the debate.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And as other members have, I would like to thank Ms Sheeran for instigating this debate on my department's policy for the provision of street lighting in rural areas of Mid-Ulster. Of course, this issue extends beyond Mid-Ulster and is relevant to rural areas across all district councils in Northern Ireland. And I have listened with interest to the comments and the issues raised by members, and I want to thank them for their very positive commentary in terms of the staff in the local division. Our staff in my department live locally and they care very deeply about their local communities and they really want to make a positive difference. So I will ensure that that positive feedback is fed back to them, because I think it is important that they get to hear of that. I recognise the importance of street lighting to the public and the contribution it makes towards communities by extending the hours in which activity can take place. As every member has highlighted, street lighting has multiple benefits for citizens, for road users and in helping communities to feel safer. In recognising this and these multiple benefits, I was pleased when I came into office to be able to commit funding to ensure a full street lighting repair scheme and to effectively, as Mr McGlone highlighted, switch the lights back on in Mid-Ulster, of which there are over 66,000 street lights, but lights right across the north. And I know many members and communities have remarked on the positive impact that this has had across the north. While in government there is so much more that we need to do, and so many of us can be focused on the big projects. I've always been keen that we get the basics right too, and getting the basics right is key to supporting our communities and enhancing the lives of citizens, no matter how big or small. My department's policy for the provision of lighting in rural areas seeks to strike a balance between a range of factors, such as the needs of rural communities, road safety, environmental effects, costs and sustainability. And the criteria, which I have inherited from predecessors, is based upon the identification, as Mr Buchanan highlighted, of a rural community which for the purpose of this policy is defined as the presence of 10 dwellings in a continuous 200-metre stretch of road. The policy recognises the importance to the community of public buildings, such as church halls or schools, and for the purposes of assessment are given a weighting and counted as 2 dwellings. I also appreciate, as Keith Buchanan highlighted along with other members, that it can also improve road safety for drivers, wheelers, cyclists and pedestrians. My department works each and every day to improve road safety, and for that reason the policy also allows for the provision of road lighting at locations where there have been a significant number of nighttime collisions and it is deemed that road lighting would contribute to road safety. However, and this is where some of the challenges begin to come in, it is also important to get the right balance between the demand for more rural lighting against, and Ms Dillon highlighted this, the unwelcome effects of increased urbanisation of the countryside, the effects on people, wildlife and flora, and the environmental impact of night sky light pollution. Members will also be aware that my department has suffered historic underinvestment. And, despite my best efforts, the resource budgetary outlook in particular is not great for this year. It represents a real terms cut, and so, this financial year will be challenging in terms of trying to maintain the level of services that we had in the previous year. I also have to consider the considerable financial costs of providing and maintaining additional public lighting installations. In recent years, due to ongoing resource and capital funding pressures, there has been a need to direct the finite resources available towards the maintenance and replacement of existing assets rather than increasing the network by providing new lighting in areas that were not previously lit. I think it's important to maybe just pause to reflect on the scale on which my department is working to make improvements across our community. So my department is responsible for around 289,000 streetlights. Out of this total, approximately 32,000 are over 40 years old, which is well beyond their intended design life of 25 years. And the cost to replace these ageing columns is estimated at £72 million. In addition, and in order to maintain the current age profile of the existing lighting stock, my department needs to replace approximately 7,000 street lighting columns per year, along with the associated cabling, at a cost of £14 million. The annual cost to maintain these lights, including outage repairs and electrical inspection and testing, is approximately £7.5 million, and this is over and above the annual electricity cost for street lighting of around £11.5 million. I don't say this to add negativity to this debate, but I think it is important that I set out the factual context in terms of the financial requirement of providing our existing service. So, all of this does present huge challenges, but as well as this, I'm very keen that we do what we can to reduce our costs. And so I am committed to reducing my department's energy use, and as members have highlighted, my department has changed almost 112,000, which is 39% of sodium streetlights, to more energy efficient LED lights, and I welcome the support that has been expressed by members about the support for the continued rollout of our LED units. This has resulted in a reduction in energy consumption of about 24%, and this programme has also delivered savings in maintenance costs due to the much longer operating life of LEDs, as well as providing environmental benefits and helping us to tackle the climate emergency. I am pleased to inform members that in order to make additional reductions in energy use, I will also be making further allocations towards LED retrofitting in this new financial year. I appreciate the list of requests that members have highlighted here today, and they have also highlighted these issues in correspondence with myself, so I know how strongly they feel about them. And I am very sympathetic to the provision of additional lighting in our rural communities. And I completely understand why people would say that we should, as a department, take a case-by-case approach. But the issue here is that we need to have one that is objective and fair and consistent. And importantly, we need to have an approach and a policy that we can fund. And that's where the challenge comes in. I think there is merit in the partnership approach that Ms Dillon particularly highlighted. And members will know that I set up the Blue-Green Infrastructure Fund to act as a catalyst for change. There may be opportunities, and Ms Dillon spoke at length about the possibility of extended pavements. So I'm wondering, is there something that we can do there? Working with Mid Ulster Council, for example, if they have proposals, I would encourage members to encourage their councillors to be working with officers to bring those through to our department to see what we can try to do. But Mr Deputy Speaker, I would like to do much more in this area, but I struggle to fund the existing service, and I struggle to fund the rollout of LED lighting within the current budgetary constraints. That doesn't mean that I'm not open and wouldn't like to change the policy. I would, but as I've said previously, I need to manage expectations. I need to be honest with people. Yes, of course.
And I understand all the issues that you've outlined there in terms of funding and what sort of the ramifications that extending the network would mean. And I know that you've referred there to my request for a case-by-case basis, but I suppose particularly in the Straw to Draperstown example, which I am literally, I couldn't count the number of requests I've had about that. If you compared that stretch of road to a stretch of road at the top of the town that has lighting and doesn't have any more entrances coming off it, I wondered if you would commit to even a site visit to come out and look at, because it wouldn't mean increased urbanisation. I know what you're saying around the increased cost, but you're literally talking about, I would say, 3 streetlights. You would fulfil your requirement there in terms of improving the safety, and it would mean that people had that option of a walking route that they are already using, but they would be able to use it in a safe manner without the apprehension and anxiety it currently produces.
I thank the member for her question, and I'm happy when I'm next up on my next visit to Mid Ulster to call and to have a look. I suppose the challenge here is that you as a member have come with a list of requests, but I get these requests right across the north, and I have to be fair in how I try to respond to all of them, and I need to make sure that I have reoccurring funding to be able to fund them. So certainly happy to take a look, and very keen that we work with local councils as well, so that we can promote active travel and also have a new cohort of budding astronomers, is it Patsy, coming from Mid Ulster as well.
Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary.